Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
Hi, this is a quick review of the book Groucho and Me, the autobiography of Groucho Marx. And when I say autobiography, while of course nothing in this world is ever completely certain, he wrote it. In fact, there are 2 points in the book where he pauses to complain about how hard writing a book is. It's actually kind of funny. Because you're going along and then he just pauses and says, it's really hard. And he talks about other people he knows who went and got ghostwriters. But he himself, is writing his own book. And he mentions that, like, every word of this, I'm writing. And man, is that hard. So Groucho Marx, presumably you recognize him, especially from the mustache. I assume everybody's seen Marx Brothers movies. If not, do. Go see some Marx Brothers movies. They're really good. I caveat on that is they are somewhat uneven. And obviously not every Marx Brothers movie is the best Marx Brothers movie they ever made. But at the same time, there's some really, really good ones. I think my favorite is A Night at the Opera. It's really quite funny. A Day at the Races is also very good. Duck Soup I remember being pretty good. Except the ending was just really, really kind of random. It was almost a little Monty Python-esque in that the ending kind of wasn't much of anything. It degenerated almost into a mob. It was pretty much just didn't end, in a sense. I really do recommend... Swing Time was also good as well. Although the swing dancing in it wasn't nearly as good as in A Day at the Races. A Day at the Races is actually kind of famous for it had in Lindy Hop, which was the swing dancing of the 1930s. It was Lindy Hop, sort of named after Charles Lindbergh, kind of, for no good reason. Just because he was famous and his name was in there, and some reporter asked somebody, "What are you doing?" And he said, "We're doing the Lindy Hop." But the name stuck, and so that's where Lindy Hop came from. There's some very famous, there's some very, very good Lindy Hoppers who actually somebody put together a dance troupe of them called, the fellow's name was Whitey, so called because he had a white streak in his hair. Supposedly he actually used shoe polish to get it. Although I believe that was just a rumor. Anyhow, so Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, there's the A team and the B team. And so the A team would do the best paying performances, and they actually were off at live events. It was a B team that was sent over to do A Day at the Races, and which is kind of interesting, especially at the time. And I should have looked this up. A Day at the Races, I think, was in the late 30s. Like the 1936 to 1939 range, somewhere in there. It could have been in the early 40s, but really, Lindy Hop essentially died out with the start of World War II. So probably somewhere in that range, late 30s. And it gives you something of a sense of how movies weren't that important still. And which actually is a good segue into... Anyway, I'm sorry. So to finish it off, A Day at the Races, there's a wonderful Lindy Hop scene, which is really amazing to see some great performance Lindy Hop by the people who actually came up with Lindy Hop. For those who don't know, I did Lindy Hop for a number of years. I mean, I still do. I just don't get many opportunities. When the little kids get older, I'll hopefully get more. But anyhow, so segueing back into this book and about movies, the Marx Brothers started out in vaudeville, I looked up the history of vaudeville, actually. Again, for those who don't know, vaudeville was a series of... each town would have stages, and vaudeville consisted of the actors and troupes and performers of various kinds would go around from town to town, and they'd go and they'd do shows for a night or a few nights in one town, then they'd get back on the train and move on. And with thousands and thousands of towns, you'd often not see the actor again. You'd see this show sort of like once in your life, maybe twice, but maybe not. Which was also something that, as I was told in early days of television, for example, a lot of what you're seeing in the early days of television are vaudeville acts. And then the problem was, in the days of vaudeville, you could live off the same act because it was always new material since you're always in a new town. And, towns separated by 20 miles sometimes might as well be separated by 1,000. Especially when it comes to small things like entertainment. So the interesting thing, so vaudeville was this very influential cultural phenomenon in many ways, especially because of its effect on the early days of television, and especially on things like variety shows, like the Ed Sullivan variety show, which almost everybody still alive was too young to have seen live. Because we're talking Ed Sullivan, I believe, we're talking about the sort of thing like where the Beatles became popular. So I may take that back, because people, people in their 60s, 70s might have seen that. But earlier, like the early days of television, we were talking like the very early 50s. People who'd have been 20 then are going to be quite old today. Anyhow, so there's a cultural significance to vaudeville, but vaudeville itself was not all that long. It needed the technology of very good railroads, like a very good railroad system, in order to exist. Very, very well developed railroad system and so on, as well as some various commercial factors that were needed. That just had to exist. Interesting topic on its own, by the way. That things where, darn phone, things where the technology exists, but there isn't a market for it. People just aren't in the habit of doing something, and so even though they can, they don't. There are a lot of interesting things like that sort of based on historical accidents. But anyway, so I'm sorry. So getting back to this, they started out in the early days of vaudeville, which, from what I can tell, vaudeville lasted like 20, maybe 30 years. It was not a very long-lived phenomenon. But it formed a whole bunch of people. A lot of people developed their material. A lot of people developed their ideas of various things. And so vaudeville was essentially killed off by the recorded picture with sound, I should say. And so movies of the 1930s, especially, tiny bit in the 20s, but really movies of the 1930s that killed off vaudeville because, well, for several reasons, including when people would, including when people would go and do their vaudeville routine on a movie, and then they couldn't really go and do it anymore. It wasn't a viable option any further. So it's it's an interesting phenomenon, the whole vaudeville thing, which takes up a lot of the book. Probably, I'm guessing, approximately the first half. So it's a really fascinating sort of cultural thing to see because it led into the development of a lot of things we're more familiar with. Then he moves on into his film career, which again was the early days of movies. Los Angeles, for example, I mean, a big part of the reason why there was a movie industry out west was because it was a lot easier to infringe patents and not pay people for things and so on. Out west, society was much less well developed. Just all sorts of reasons. It was much freer, much easier to get away with things. And throughout its entire history, the movie industry seems largely to be about getting away with things. With exceptions, of course. But whenever I read about it, that does seem to be a common trend. Anyway, so the movie career, in the early days of the movie career, especially when even more things went than do today, and then the final portion of the book, he talks about his move to his television career, because another thing that Groucho was known for in later years, though we mostly know him these days by the Marx Brothers movies, was he did a TV show. And Marx Brothers, he actually did it with his brothers. The TV show, he did it on his own, called You Bet Your Life, which was too great. It was a game show, but much of the show was about Groucho's improv banter with the guests. He's a very, very witty man, very quick on his feet, which is one reason why it's very credible that he wrote the book, both because he seems like the sort of person who could, and at the same time, and the other thing too, being that the style just matches very much the sort of style he had any place you can see him where he's improvising. So it really fits that it really is from him. And so he talks about that. And again, when he got into You Bet Your Life, you're talking about that was a show that ran in, I believe, the 1950s. I actually saw an episode or two of it, and it was fairly good. Not great, not always great, especially because the guests were sometimes a little bit flat, and Groucho could only do so much. It's the hazard of just having random people. But it really is. It's really a very, very interesting book because Groucho Marx is an interesting person, and it's also kind of fascinating because, so much of anything having to do with movies and television is image. That a lot of what he talks about is very much the business side of things. He's got, all sorts of stories about being shafted by somebody who didn't pay him, or someone who ran away with the money, or all sorts of things of that nature. People who broke deals and stuff like that. But it's really interesting. He talks about, a lot about simply the business side, because actors, well, need to earn a living. And, there are lucky few, especially these days, actors, a few actors get paid so well they don't really need to worry about money, with the asterisk that many of them apparently aren't very good at managing their money, so they start having to worry about it pretty quickly again. But that being said, a lot of actors, there are some actors who don't have to worry so much. Actors as famous as Groucho was in his day, back then much less so. They didn't get paid nearly as well back then as the best paid actors do today. That's my understanding of it. Things changed around a bit over time. But especially, I think at the time they didn't really understand the archival nature, the way you can make money over a very long term with movies in like the 1930s. They didn't understand that nearly as well as we do now. So a lot of pricing for actors, voice actors, all sorts of things takes into account the fact that this is a very long-lived thing, so that the business people are going to be making money off of it for a very long time, and so that gets priced into what people cost, or people services cost, I should say. So it's very much historical. Groucho Marx has been dead for decades. It's very, very interesting. And again, when I grew up, the early days of film and television were, I think, more culturally significant than they are at present. So people, growing up right now, I think this stuff is, because, I grew up in the 80s. And in the 80s, television had only been around for like 30 years. And the 1950s were only about 50 years ago. And so there was far, far less in the way of, there's far less in between. It was an interesting time period to be alive, because so much of the art forms that were so popular were also so very recent. Theater's been around for thousands of years. Not any individual theater, obviously. And, English language theater only dates back as far as English. But at the same time, theater as an art form is very, very old. People who are writing plays now are, in some trivial sense, competing with Euripides. And competing with Shakespeare. Shakespeare's still put on constantly, and, your play has to be more worth seeing than going and seeing Hamlet again, because seeing Hamlet for the 15th time is still a pretty good experience. But, television had a lot less of that, and so there was much more recent stuff. The very significant things were far more fresh at the time, and which also interestingly resulted in a phenomenon I had. There are people who knew, they had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the history of film. And something I hadn't realized at the time when I was young and I'd see this and be so impressed by it, is part of what enabled this was there just wasn't that much to know. Film was so recent. There were so few really, really popular movies. And a lot of the a lot of the very significant ones had been made 10 years ago, which would be very much within the memory, the recent memory of people significantly older than I am who had these encyclopedic, sorts of knowledges. So we're witnessing very much a changeover as things move into classics and become different sorts of classics. We're much further along with novels. The first novel, what exactly is the first novel is hard to date, and a few of the really early ones are largely forgotten. But curiously enough, one of the first novels was Robinson Crusoe, written in the early 1700s, roughly. And there isn't a tremendous amount between that and the end of the 1700s. That's in English, obviously. Don Quixote, or The Man of La Mancha. I can't remember the proper title. It's known by both. But anyway, those are well known in, that one I think actually predated. But you don't have much until you hit the early 1800s, and you have something like Pride and Prejudice, published in, I believe, 1806. which was actually which was her second. I think her first, Jane Austen's first, was published in like 1803, 1804. Interestingly enough, that they, on Wikipedia at least, the first cover page said Sense and Sensibility by a lady, and then the cover to Pride and Prejudice said Pride and Prejudice by the author of Sense and Sensibility. But so it was very early. I mean, there hadn't obviously been novels because there's a reference to them in Pride and Prejudice. There's a part where, for those of you who read it, you'll remember when Mr. Wickham's relating tales of his misfortunes, and Elizabeth's father, Mr. Bennet, says, "How kind of him to regale us with tales of his misfortune, with such narratives to hand. Who would read novels?" And but at the same time, a novel was a relatively, from what I understand, a relatively low class thing. Hence why, for example, they pulled out, when there was a guest over and they wanted to impress, they pulled out Fordyce's sermons for him to read. So novels were still relatively recent. Obviously, there had been a bunch, but only not too many. But the thing is, that's slightly over 200 years ago that you start seeing some classics that we really remember. Starting right around then, by the time you hit the 1820s, I think you get. I can't remember exactly. Frankenstein was like somewhere in the 1810s to the 1820s, if I recall. And you start getting like Gothic stuff, which we remember some, like Frankenstein, and then you get a lot of novels in the later part of the 1800s, and then by the time of the 1900s, it's a well-established form of literature. By the time of the late 1900s, it's actually a prestigious form of entertainment. The idea of, well, at least the higher class stuff, but you hit things like Murder, She Wrote, in which Jessica Fletcher is an author, and she is, I mean, very, very unrealistically, but everyone knows her, and people are just so amazed that here an author walks among us. And, some people greet her with like, "Well, you're nothing special," as sort of a defensive thing, but everyone sort of regards it as something important. Then you get the higher literary ones, which there have been a few characters like that. Forget whether or not they're the murderers very often, but the high literary person who's well above the the popular stuff that people like. But the fact that you can have that, the high literary form where this is a true artist, the demigod walking among men, is, I believe, relatively recent. It's not the sort of thing like an author of novels is not the sort of thing that would have had that sort of reputation, I think, in like the very early 1900s. They were still sort of more popular entertainment, and it's only over time, as things become classic and then become taught, that the fact that people taught things that were written before the people they're teaching were born sort of elevates those things to the level of other things written before they were born, like some of the Greek classics, like the Odyssey and the Iliad. Because there's an interesting time compression that goes on where people tend to regard everything that happened before they were born as sort of one cohesive time period, even though it radically wasn't. In the same way that people tend to think that whatever societal degeneration happened right around their youth, that's where parents complain about and so on. And this comes up. I've seen it. Looking at divorce, that people talk about like the advent of no-fault divorce in the 1970s is as when things went really bad. But in fact, having looked up the history of it a bit, no-fault divorce was actually just a reaction to the way that people were lying in court so much about people being at fault, like literally hiring people to pretend to have affairs with and so on, so as to have cause for divorce. That they that basically no-fault divorce was passed so that people wouldn't be lying in court so much and would still have some respect for the law. And if you look at it, the U.S. Census Bureau. Now I'm talking obviously about America here. I don't know about data for other countries, but the U.S. Census Bureau started tracking divorce in the 1870s, and it rose. It was rising by the 1880s, or the 1890s at least. The resolution's a little bit low at first. The divorce rate was like 1 in 1,000, like one divorce per 1,000 people, or something like that, and it was really interesting because I think I've put this on my blog. I forget if I have. I'll find it and put it again at some point. I'll probably feature it here too on a proper video. But the divorce rate, if you look at it, like if you draw a line between the current divorce rate, I'm sorry, from your perspective, the current divorce rate and, was that from your perspective? I can't recall. Anyway, and the 1970s, I'm sorry, and the present day, There are a few blips. There's a big decrease during World War II, a big increase right after, sort of spike, which has an obvious explanation. There's something around some fuzz around the Great Depression as well. And then, there's a big spike. I'm sorry, from your perspective. Yeah, I forget. I can't do it. But anyway, there's a big spike around the 1970s with the introduction of no-fault divorce. But then it leveled off until it hit, basically, if you would draw a line with the previous trend, once it came and hit that line, as it came up and then flattened out until it hit that line and then started following the line again. So if you look between, the earlier time and the present day on the census data, the blips really don't affect the overall trend. And so that's, as I said, a trend you can see starting in the 1800s, the late 1800s. And so people talk about, the dissolution of society as if it's something very recent. As far as I can tell, baby boomers talk about it as starting when they were kids. The children of baby boomers talk about it, starting with the baby boomers. And people born now will probably talk about the society, morals becoming lax and divorce becoming rampant and so on. Talk about that as if that started now. So it speaks to that sort of time compression that goes on. But the upshot of it, and the reason I brought it up, is that books that were written before one was born, like All Quiet on the Western Front, The Catcher in the Rye, and so on, for people who were students in the last 20 years, they were written before we were born, and then so was the Odyssey and the Iliad. So obviously the one was written beforehand, but they all take on that long ago sort of aura to them. And I suspect that is the phenomenon that allows people to elevate things into into that sort of people had give them the same status, that these ancient books had a very high status. And so once perceptual time compression took novels and put them into sort of a similar long ago, that you can teach these to people as something that you'd never have experienced, but this is actually worth dredging up from the past, that lends something. That really lends, mystique. It lends prestige. So novels had that, and and there's a certain degree to which people regard some movies as art these days. Although, there are art movies, which in general, refers to movies that are so painful to watch that the only possible reason you could watch them is for some sort of spiritual purification. There's one I remember in this art house, still to this day. It was about some really miserable lesbians who tried to be happy, were miserable, tried to be happy but failed, and were just as miserable, and then one of them killed themselves by drinking glass. Ground up glass, put it and drank it, and the other one, found her dead lover with the blood coming out of her mouth and was, I'd say, more miserable, except they were totally miserable. There's another one about some Irishman who didn't want to work in the mines, then did and was killed. Like those sort of things, are art films. But that's to distinguish them from films that people actually want to see. Large numbers of people want to see, I mean. That stands in contrast to things like Casablanca, where people look at that, and that was a really good movie. It's a little underappreciated that Casablanca is a comedy, but it's a really good movie. Or A Man for All Seasons is a really, really good movie. It's very watchable. Pardon the noise. It's very watchable. It's very it's very good. But at the same time, it's very watchable. It was fairly popular. I mean, millions and millions of people saw it. It's it's not, I wouldn't call it upbeat, but at the same time, if you understood properly, the hero does win in the end. Anyhow, sorry, I really need to draw this to a close. I'm sorry, I've been going on for so long. But it's a really good movie, and there are a bunch of movies like that are really good. They were just really, really well done, even though they're popular entertainment. Shakespeare's plays come into that same category. They're very popular in his day. They're very popular amongst people who were not especially well educated in his day. They're very popular amongst people who were well educated in his day, so far as I know. So Shakespearean plays were the popular entertainment of the time, and they were just really, really good. And we've seen movies like that, similar quality and so on, as we're getting far enough away from when they were made that they can sort of have that luster of, that luster of distance, and also the filter of distance, as everyone forgets about the junk that no one cares about. People didn't care about much then and don't care about now. So it's within movies, movies are getting that, are just starting to get that. We can see that fairly clearly with novels. Plays, have been high, have been both high and low class. But have been very good entertainment. They're Greek tragedies that that have been studied for since the medieval period. Long before, obviously. But as high literature, even if they were possibly popular entertainment of their day, and they kind of were. So the these things, as they age, the best stuff rises and becomes sort of classic, and gains an aura of being art, or even possibly high art, even if it wasn't considered high art in its day. And I think we're seeing that with movies. And which brings me back to this, and the reason why I was talking about this is that this talks about, this is a really interesting view of the beginning of that, of where that was getting started, and really an insider view from somebody who made some really good movies that do stand the test of time. There is some extremely funny stuff, some extremely witty dialogue, really fast, witty dialogue, some great scenes and so on. So anyway, in conclusion, if you possibly get the opportunity, I recommend Groucho and Me. It's not a hard read. It's very entertaining, just like Groucho generally was. And it's really interesting from a historical perspective. So thanks for watching, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.
Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
Hi. This is a quick review of the book Groucho and Me, the autobiography of Groucho Marx. And when I say autobiography, while of course nothing in this world is ever completely certain, he wrote it. In fact, there are 2 points in the book where he pauses to complain about how hard writing a book is. It's actually kind of funny. Because you're going along, and then he just pauses and says, it's really hard. And he talks about other people he knows who went and got ghostwriters, but he himself, is writing his own book. And he mentions that, like, every word of this, I'm writing. And man, is that hard. So Groucho Marx, presumably you recognize him, especially from the mustache. I assume everybody's seen Marx Brothers movies. If not, do. Go see some Marx Brothers movies. They're really good. Okay, I caveat on that is they are somewhat uneven. And obviously not every Marx Brothers movie is the best Marx Brothers movie they ever made. But at the same time, there's some really, really good ones. I think my favorite is A Night at the Opera. It's really quite funny. A Day at the Races is also very good. Duck Soup I remember being pretty good, except the ending was just really, really kind of random. It was almost a little Monty Python-esque in that the ending kind of wasn't much of anything. It degenerated almost into a mob. It was pretty much just didn't end, in a sense. I really do recommend, Swing Time was also good as well. Although the swing dancing in it wasn't nearly as good as in A Day at the Races. A Day at the Races is actually kind of famous for, it had, in Lindy Hop, which was the swing dancing of the 1930s. It was Lindy Hop, sort of named after Charles Lindbergh, kind of, for no good reason. Just because he was famous and his name was in there, and some reporter asked somebody, "What are you doing?" And he said, "We're doing the Lindy Hop." But the name stuck, and so that's where Lindy Hop came from. There's some very famous, there's some very, very good Lindy Hoppers who actually put together, somebody put together a dance troupe of them called, the fellow's name was Whitey, so called because he had a white streak in his hair. Supposedly he actually used shoe polish to get it. Although I believe that was just a rumor. Anyhow, so Whitey's Lindy Hoppers